My name is Dr. Krista Tooley. Thank you. I'm liking the feel of this crowd already. This is great. I'm the director of the Center for Urban Engagement, and I'm here right now to introduce our third speaker for the Equitas Lecture Series, Dr. Junia Howell.
This is a popularity contest going on.
The other Dr. Howell. Our first two speakers for the Equitas Lecture Series were Carlo Rotella and Jamie Calvin, and stay tuned because we do still have our fourth speaker coming up, and his name is Reuben Miller. But Dr. Junia Howell comes to us after graduating from Wheaton with a degree in sociology. She went on to receive her Ph.D. in sociology from Rice University, and she now teaches and conducts research at the University of Pittsburgh, where she is an assistant professor of sociology. Dr. Howell's research examines racial and socioeconomic inequality, focusing on how such inequality can be influenced by factors like neighborhoods, segregation, housing appraisal practices, and, as we'll hear tonight, natural disasters. Dr. Howell's work can be found not only in a range of prestigious academic journals, but also on NPR, in The Atlantic, and in the New York Times. I am privileged to have been one of the Wheaton professors who had the pleasure of teaching Junia in one course during her undergraduate education. And tonight I feel especially privileged to have this opportunity to learn from her as well.
Thank you.
Will you join me in welcoming Dr. Junia Howell, urban sociologist, to speak to us about winners and losers, how natural disasters and our responses are enriching the privileged and devastating the marginalized.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. All right, y'all are church people, so you're used to this. But the first thing I heard about this room was it's awkward if people come in late. So if y'all are sitting over there and are willing, scoot in. You know in church when they make you scoot to the middle? Scoot to the middle a little bit, so if anyone else comes in, they have seats. Also, if you want to, feel free to come up front. I don't bite. I might hit you on accident with my hands, but I don't bite. All right, anyways, thanks for your energy. I love it. We're going to use it. You can't sit there quiet. I need you to talk back to me. So first, when I say natural disasters, what do you think? Oh, thank you. Very good. And you mean in the not in the vain way, in the Jesus please come save me way, right? All right, just checking, just checking. All right, so oh my God, what else? Hurricanes, thank you. Y'all have no other thoughts? Tsunami. Okay, hurricanes, tsunami. Earthquakes, thank you. Tornadoes, yes. No fires, anyone? Yes, floods, fires, okay. Yeah, so there's lots of things we thought about, or we think about. I was thinking about all the fires, given the recent happenings in Australia, obviously, in our own country in California. Often we think about hurricanes, floods. We think about tornadoes, particularly in the Midwest region of which we are currently, although, you know, them happening here is not quite as common as South, but they do happen here. But often, when we think about natural disasters, when we think about that quote-unquote oh my God moment, we think of large, sudden events that happen in a few places. You probably think of the hurricane Katrina's, if you're a little bit more my age and not most of y'all are his age, you might think of Hurricane Harvey, you think of Hurricane Maria maybe, you think of the wildfires, you think of these big, big happenings. But the truth is, natural disasters happen all over our country. Okay, so this is a map. It is by county. Well, yes, thankfully you knew this was a map. Obviously, it's a map. It's varied in color, so the darker red means there's more natural hazards. The gray means there's no natural hazards in this particular time period, which right now I have up there 2010, 2015. Looking there, how many counties can you identify have 0 natural hazards? Yeah, Wisconsin up there. Yeah, where else do you see that gray? Yep, parts of Pennsylvania, absolutely. Sorry, what? Maine, yep, okay, so yeah. But So we can identify a few places. I'll point out that those are often also more rural places. If you notice, there's a high correlation there. Because I didn't explain exactly that what this map is specifically is the amount of property damage that has been done by a natural disaster. So if you have a more rural area, you're going to have less property damage. But what I really want you to notice about this map is there's like no real gray spaces when we think about it in the big sense. In fact, if we trace back, which I don't have a map up today, but if we trace back to 2000 and go 2000 to the present, only one county in our country has not had a registered natural disaster on our national registry. Meaning this is a much more pervasive and continual issue that is growing because of climate change, and is something that, although you might not think you're going to face in your life, the chances are you are. But more importantly, the way that we're responding to natural disasters has become a literal multi-billion-dollar industry because it's so pervasive. So that's the first thing I want you to think about and challenge about when I say natural hazards. They're not just large, sudden, happening in a few places. They're continual, they're pervasive, and some are small, some are large, and everything in between. The second thing that people often think about when it comes to natural disasters, and I'm sorry, I'm going to keep picking on you, but the oh my God moment, when we think about this, we think about them hurting everyone. The rich, the poor, we think about them just coming and destroying everything in their wake, which in some ways is true, but there's a lot more going on there. So when academic research, particularly sociologists, started studying natural disasters, they looked at specific case studies. So these are some of the most well-known of these case studies. And they dove in and tried to understand what was going on after a natural disaster, particularly with the question of who is this affecting and how might that be affecting inequality, something sociologists are apt to always ask and look at. And the general gist of this literature has been a discourse that natural disasters reveal inequality. They kind of like pull the curtain off. So this is what the narrative became a lot around Katrina, right? That there was inequality, but we didn't notice it as much. Katrina hit, and all of a sudden, all the inequality was just very visible and very bad. But the undercurrent of that discussion is not actually thinking about how the natural disaster is affecting inequality. It's just saying this inequality exists, and the natural disaster helped us see it. Do you see that? So what's interesting is because of how we've studied this, the methods we've used to study natural disasters, particularly in sociology, but in other fields as well, is we actually haven't been able to look at if disasters are creating inequality. And that's because we've only focused on where disasters happen. But if we want to understand if they're having an impact, we need to compare them to places that didn't have disasters. So here are my little two people who have the same amount of income. They're just like same on everything in a hypothetical sense in the US. And one gets hit with a natural disaster and the other doesn't. What we can do when we compare this methodologically is then be able to identify how the natural disaster is actually affecting them. Does that make sense? So we're going to start diving into this methodological question. And because I'm obnoxious and I see all the people standing, I'm just going to say, y'all, I told you to move over, and now people don't have seats. But I would also, y'all, you can stand if you want, but I invite you to sit up here. There's so many seats. Ask these people to move. They're nice. They don't bite. We're going to be here for a minute. Y'all don't want to stand, I promise. Okay, just calling it out. I don't mind. I'm so excited you're here. I just want you to get to sit down. Okay, so methodologically, if we can compare these things, we can actually look at what's going on with disasters. And in fact, we can look and test. Oh, sorry. I forgot where I was going with this because I got distracted because I was like, poor people don't got no seats. So our assumption is that as disasters come, then after disaster, the person who got hit with disaster has less. In particular, I'm symbolizing that as like wealth or money here. And so then we're making the assumption in the literature that if you have two people who are in the area where the disaster, one with more money and one with less, when the disaster comes, they both suffer, but everyone's suffering. That's the story. That's what's going on. But what I wanted to test in this series of work that has become a whole world into itself, to be honest, but started as a paper, as most things do, is I wanted to be able to compare people with a random sample from across the US and see if we can isolate the effect of disasters, how that might be manifesting inequality, and in particularly how our policy responses to that are affecting what's going on. Y'all with me? All right, cool. So we got a random sample. If you're used to that, great. We particularly want to look over time, because the other big piece of this, as we were looking at those maps, are these are not just one-time things. The really interesting thing about disasters is they're happening, as I already said, more and more, and they're happening habitually. And what that means is if you live through one, you're likely to live through another. So let's not just look at how this one affected you, but how this long-term impact is affecting. So the particular work that I'm going to show you first today is starting in 1999 and going to 2013. Some of my more recent work coming off of this project is obviously also using more recent years, and the results are similar, but this is the time period that I'm focusing on. So as I already said, we have people from around the country, but we also, because we're looking across time, we can also follow them as they move. So as they're moving, we're tracking them, so they might not just have lived in one place. And that enables us to start to create these statistical comparisons or statistical models where we have people who are equivalent in all sorts of different things, but what they vary on is the kind of natural disasters, if it's fires or tornadoes or hurricanes that they've survived. Specifically, we're interested in holding things constant or comparing people who have similar family structure. So do you have kids? Are you married? All that kind of stuff. What's your income? What's your education, your age, your race, your gender, et cetera? What neighborhood do you live in? Also, information about your county. Is it an urban county, et cetera, et cetera. What this does, again, is enables us to isolate that effect of natural disasters. So when I say natural disasters, the other word that's often used in the literature is natural hazards. We can get in a whole debate about the pros and cons of those two words if you want, but I'm going to use them interchangeably for this talk. But it includes everything from tornadoes to fires to floods to hurricanes, severe winter storms, everything that goes onto the Federal Registry, which is, I think, 15 different categories. Windstorms count, et cetera. And when we think about the effects of these, we know that natural hazards affect a lot of things. So obviously they affect your housing, right? If something's going to happen, it's going to come in, it's going to affect your housing. What else do you think natural hazards might affect? School attendance, absolutely. Education. What else? Food, yeah. What else? Water. Mm-hmm. Internet, anyone? Let's be real. What are you going to miss first, the electricity or the food? What else? What else can it be affecting? Infrastructure, yes. Transportation, buildings, all of these things. Anything else? Mental health, thank you. Yes, mental health and physical health, right? That is usually a very central and a very key thing with first responders is the health implications. So yeah, so we have housing, we have health. Thank you for getting that. I knew it was my next one. I was waiting for someone. Savings or long-term impacts on your wealth, your transportation, your employment, your education, et cetera. There's lots of things that we care about. And in a series of papers, I've looked at these various outcomes. And at the end, if you want to ask me about these other outcomes, I'm happy to do that. But today, I'm going to focus on wealth. So before I dive into what that is, I want to make sure that we're on the same page about what wealth is, particularly when I'm using it in an academic sociology sense. When sociologists say wealth, they use it what other people say net worth. It's the same thing. But what it is the addition of all your assets minus your debts. So let's make this practical. Give me some assets that you all in this room have. What are assets that you have? I told you I'll have to talk back to me. I'm going to have to start walking and calling on you even though I don't know your names. Okay, car. Thank you. Car. Yes. Wi-Fi. Okay. Yes. So Wi-Fi is definitely a resource you have. When we say asset, thank you for saying that, because let me clarify. When we say asset, we mean something that you could exchange for capital. So it would kind of be hard to, I mean, maybe in an abstract way we can exchange something for Wi-Fi for capital. But I'm thinking like a car. A house, I know a lot of you probably don't own a house, but your family might own a house. Some of you in this room own houses. So houses and cars are big ones we think about. But I mean, if we want to be technical, if you own any like fancy purses or clothes, like those could be assets, right? So anything that you could like sell and liquefy your money or your assets when we say that. Does that make more sense? Can you all start making a list of all those things? I know many of you who are undergrads probably feel like you don't have many assets. But if you think about your whole family, sorry, I know I'm playing with the mic. I realize my necklace is tied, and that's making weird sounds. So I realized that was weird noises going on. Okay, so your whole family has some assets. So it's all those assets minus your debt. So give me some debt that you all have in this room, and I know y'all know your debt. Yes, student loans, number one. Thank you. Okay, what else? That's it, just student loans. Yeah, so mortgage is another common one, credit card debt, car notes, etc. Okay, y'all with me? Wealth is your assets minus your debts. It's like what you got if you had to like just get it down to cash. Okay, so we're gonna look at how natural disasters are affecting wealth over this time period. All right, so specifically, what I'm going to show you, I'm going to jump to the results, and when I'm jumping to the results, I'm going to compare two hypothetically identical people on all those kind of controls that I mentioned, but one that's experienced a lot of natural disasters and one that's not experienced any at all. Now remember, this is hypothetical. I'm using it to show the patterns in the data because there's very few people in the US and thus in this data set that have experienced absolutely no natural disasters in their area at all. You following me? Okay, so specifically, a lot is going to be $1 billion in property damage from natural hazards, and the none is going to be 0. And so what we're going to do is we're going to mathematically look at the wealth of the person who experienced a lot of disasters and compare it to the wealth of the person that didn't experience a lot of disasters. And then we're going to see how different they are. And what that's going to enable us to do is to isolate the effect of disaster on the wealth apart from all the other life things that are happening in the world that are affecting wealth inequality. You're with me? All right. It's great. So that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to show you a series of graphs where I'm just showing you how much wealth the person who's experienced a natural hazard is getting from the natural hazard because I'm netting out the wealth that they would have got if they lived somewhere else. Okay? So remember, this is over time and across those decades. So on this first graph, we have college-educated individuals, and we have those with an 8th grade education. What's the first thing you notice? They're not the same. There's discrepancy. Who's got more money? Might feel slightly better about your student loans, maybe not, I don't know. Okay, so there's discrepancy here. What else do you notice? Are these positive numbers or negative numbers? So what does that mean? What is this graph? It's not just their wealth, it's the wealth what? From disasters. This means the people living through disaster are making more money at this end of this time period than the people that didn't experience any disaster. Not at all what I expected going into this research, not at all what we would expect, right? Big disasters hit, we expect that to affect your wealth, your health, all these things in the long term. It's in fact making people richer. Specifically, you can see there's discrepancies here. Those discrepancies also happen across home ownership and renting, and particularly across race. So here I'm isolating the 3 largest quote-unquote racial groups in the US, white, black, and Latinx. What you'll notice is this is compared to their own counterparts. So whites living in natural disasters are making more money from natural disasters, just like those summary statistics of the education and home ownership, while in particular the black population is losing wealth compared to their black counterparts. So not only compared to their white neighbors, but compared to their black counterparts who didn't experience the disaster. So disaster is costing them while actually benefiting their white neighbors. This is further exacerbated when you look in through an intersectional approach and combine this educational and rental owning element. Now, if you want to get even more depressed, when you add to the model FEMA aid, so FEMA is our federal response to natural disasters. So when you also add into the model how much money actually went from the federal government to that specific county, this inequality grows even higher. So you see those things expand. I went back to just the race for that moment, and you see the Latinx actually flip entirely. Meaning that instead of mitigating this inequality, our federal aid is exacerbating it. How we are responding to disasters, what's become a multi-billion-dollar industry, is making, particularly in this case, racial wealth inequality grow over time. A quite depressing and alarming and important story, given that so much money of our federal tax dollars are going into this to literally make certain of our population literally gain wealth, gain money, just because they live through natural disasters and they're white and homeowners and educated. So before I get into why, I want to just bring it home a little bit and give you some examples from DuPage County. So, sorry, I need some water. I looked these up today because I was like, let's have fun. And I first was just curious because I didn't know. How much has DuPage County experienced natural disasters? So again, I'm using that property gauge. So what the cost, the amount of property damage in DuPage County. I'm going to start in 1999 and go 2015. So in 1999, none. 2000, none. 2001, none. Then we start seeing some natural disasters. So 2002 in this time period was the first. Almost $200,000. This is cumulative, so I'm going to just keep adding the money so we see the total over this time period. You're going to see this number keep going up, and there's a couple years as I'm going here, like these ones in the middle that again didn't have any, but then you really start to see a spike. In fact, if we keep going all the way, we end up at, $33 million in this time period. This isn't Texas or Louisiana. We're in DuPage County in Illinois. Your county has experienced $33 million in property damage from disasters from 2000 to 2015. So how has that affected your racial inequality here? This is the projections from the model onto DuPage County. And given the DuPage County specificities of race and homeownership, et cetera, so on average, just from the natural disasters, net of everything else, whites in this county have gained, on average as a family, about $150,000, while your black residents have lost wealth. In fact, that has increased the racial wealth gap in this time period in DuPage County by $133,000. This is for families. So we're not talking the whole county, we're talking how much families have changed in their own gap of wealth. So why is this happening? Well, there's lots of reasons. There's three mechanisms that I'm going to focus on today. The first, and I would argue most central, is how we evaluate damage and then how we give aid to that damage, and that surrounds property and housing. The second is the actual bureaucratic processes of how people get aid, particularly the federal aid, but also, if you will, the nonprofit aid as well. And the third is how various agencies are working together or not working together to make this happen. So these are the three mechanisms. I'm going to do something a little odd, and I'm going to talk about them in the inverse because I want to spend the most time on housing, which is the first one. So we'll come to that last. So this multi-agency thing, what do I mean by this? Well, as natural disasters has increased, as the need has increased, multiple of our federal and even on the state level, agencies have gotten involved in responding to disasters. Great, I'm so grateful, we need them, that's not the bad thing. The hard thing is they also bring to their table their own policy agendas. My favorite example of this is what became known as the blue tarp houses in Houston, Texas. So Hurricane Ike hit in Houston, Texas, and I moved to Houston for graduate school a couple years after Ike, and I moved into a neighborhood which I moved there for intentional life decisions, and then later realized it's the second poorest neighborhood in the country, and according to the census, 0% of the population was white, which you only can get like a 0% in a city like Houston that's that diverse, and of course, that I knew too, but you know, they don't always get picked up because the census is only every so many years. But what I noticed right away was a lot of these houses had these blue tarps. And there were so many weird things about moving from where I was coming from, Chicago and Cincinnati, to Houston. That wasn't like the first thing I started asking questions about. I was like, okay, people have tarps on their house. But I started to be like, what's going on? And I learned that houses with blue tarps had been identified by federal programs as houses that qualified for aid after Hurricane Ike. However, the money that was sponsoring this particular rehab was under HUD. And HUD is the Housing and Urban Development. And one of HUD's goals is to decrease residential racial segregation. So as part of that, they have put a clause on their their natural disaster aid that only so much of it can go to what they classify as segregated neighborhoods. So once it hit a cap of fixes in my neighborhood, there was literally millions sitting downtown Houston, that were identified to fix these roofs, but couldn't be spent because the neighborhood was too black and brown. But of course, those individuals didn't have the capital to move, so then it became this weird stuck place. The last blue tarp houses started to get fixed from other policies and other programs that started dealing with it in 2017, which is when I was moving out of Houston. And of course, that's when Hurricane Harvey hit. Hurricane Harvey hit, HUD comes to the rescue again. They're allocating $5.6 billion, and they put a clause on it that a certain proportion of that billion has to go to homeowners. And the way that that clause is written, it also identifies neighborhood conditions that is disproportionately, by disproportionately, I mean really disproportionately, affecting the Black and Latinx communities. In fact, there's a federal lawsuit, which I'm serving as an expert witness on right now, that's suing HUD for this very reason. So there are, while sometimes good-intentioned clauses, problematic elements of those clauses, not just in HUD, but in all these partner agencies that combined don't always deal with the immediate surrounding needs after a natural disaster, in particular their intersections with race and class, et cetera. That second mechanism in the middle there is the bureaucratic processes. Now, if you want to go into more details, I have so many stories about this part, and the current research I'm doing is looking more into it. But the quick story is specifically the bureaucratic policies that we set up around natural disasters have been designed to minimize fraud. Great intention, problematic impacts. So for example, you have to be able to show certain levels of deeds. You have to be able to show that you have lived in certain areas for a long enough time. If your house just got flooded, the likelihood that you're going to have all the paperwork you need is not always there. And if you don't have the resources to get lawyers to help you fill that out and to work those systems, and even necessarily the paperwork you need in the first place, not to mention any kind of undocumented populations, et cetera, there are many, many elements of the actual ways that these things manifest that are perpetuating inequality. Not to mention that when a very large natural hazard hits and a presidential declaration is made, that the FEMA gets to decide where the offices are. And they intentionally make sure those offices are in a safe place that the workers coming from out of town will feel comfortable in being. And they rarely, never, look at public transit or other accessibility questions. So how do you get to these places, especially when so much of the infrastructure and transportation has been affected, has all these implications on who's getting the aid. But those issues aside, I would argue the largest piece of this inequality is rooted in that when we go to address natural hazards, particularly as a federal government, but also as insurance, private insurance, as well as even some nonprofits, our key thing, and this goes back historically all the way back to the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, is we want to restore property. Not necessarily people in their lives, but property. And so we're going to evaluate how we're going to store that by how much we think that property is worth. And when we have very differential ideas of how much that property is worth, then that has implications on who's getting money and not. So I want to unpack that further and get to transition into one of my other hats, which is how we evaluate property and the property appraisal system. So if you bought a house, you might know that often there's all these hoops and jumps and all these kind of crazy things, and the first time you do it, you're like, what the heck is this process, and has anyone else ever done this successfully? But part of it, usually, especially if you're getting a mortgage, includes getting an appraisal. An appraisal is an evaluation of how much that property is worth. And the most common way of getting an appraisal is they pick 3 comparable houses or recent sales and use that as a way to determine how much your house is worth. Now, theoretically, they could pull it from anywhere, any neighborhood that looks like anything, but they often, and disproportionately so, pull from one specific area that is geographically close to the place that you're selling the house. This idea traces back all the way back to the 1930s. So go with me in time for a second. I'm going to give you a quick history lesson. 1929, stock market crashes. The economic implications of that raised to power FDR and his administration. Part of his promise was to restore the middle class, and in particular, restore the middle class by fundamentally changing home ownership and how we evaluated and thought about property. And this was embedded in the 1934 Federal Housing Act, which established the FHA. Now, up to this point, in order to buy a house, on average, if you did get a mortgage, which was not very common, but if you did get a mortgage, the average length of a mortgage was 3 to 5 years. The down payment was usually 50%. So you had to basically have most of the money and get it all paid in just a couple years. So who was buying property? Wealthy white men. And in fact, in many states at this point, there was still laws about that it was wealthy white men and not anyone else. But it definitely wasn't a middle class thing to do. So FDR's administration had this vision. We are going to change home ownership so that it's accessible for the middle class. And the reason this is important is we're going to make it not only a stable place for you to live, but a place for you to accumulate wealth. So I know you've all heard this on various ways, but we have this notion that the main way that you can accumulate wealth in this country is to own a house and live in that house and get wealth over time from that. That was rooted in FDR's administration and their vision. So in order to do that, the first thing they thought they needed to do was change mortgages. So they wanted to reduce the down payment dramatically and make the average mortgage 30 years. Okay, wait, let's just reel that in a second. We're going from 3 to 5 years to 30 years. What bank is going to want to go from usually giving a mortgage from 3 to 5 years to 30? The answer is none. So the federal government had to incentivize them to do that. The federal government says, all right, we will insure these mortgages so that if they default, at the end of the day, we pick up the slack, 2008 anyone, but for you, so that you will give these mortgages. But the federal government didn't want to take all the risk, because that's a lot of risk. So they institutionalized an appraisal industry that really did not exist before 1934. And they institutionalized this industry by creating the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. And in partnership with the FHA and HOLC, they created a system where they would evaluate how much property is worth based on the neighborhood. Heard of redlining, anyone? So that's the colloquial term used for this. So this is a map of Pittsburgh, because that's where I'm living right now. But you can look up almost every city in the US now on Google, redlining map, you can find something similar. They created 4 levels. Green was the best, followed by blue, yellow, red. They were rated A, B, C, D. There's lots of documentation and historical work on this that shows that they based them off of a mix of race and socioeconomic status. They literally ranked the neighborhoods based on who was living there and said that's how much those properties are worth. So what that did was not only create a system of who could get mortgages, which is what most of the literature is focused on, it also created a system of wealth accumulation that was completely racialized, where whites not only had access to those mortgages, but their houses appreciated while communities of color did not. And so their investment, if they were able to make one, was not one that was going to financially benefit them in the long run. This was what was the land of the law until a series of actually 4 different acts that the combination of which outlawed redlining in the way that we think about it historically, culminating in the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act. Since that point, the main way, so during this method, is when during this time period is also when they created the comp system. So use these maps, and then they're like, okay, I'm gonna look at this house and compare a house in the same coded area, and that's how I'm going to create it. So in 1977, they were no longer allowed to use these explicit maps or ones like them made by the federal government or local industry, but they could still use the comp system. There was no attempt to deal with the historical legacy, and so if you're using the comp, y'all follow me? If you're using the comp system that we've already been using, we've embedded that system in a racial hierarchy. So this element of appraising is one that me and a dear friend and good co-author started to investigate. And so we first started investigating it in Houston because of some life events that led us to be like, what's going on here? And so part of it included ethnographic work where we were looking, following around to various appraisers and real estate agents and understanding how they were picking comps and what they were doing. And one appraiser mentioned to us that the near north side, so this is a map of Houston if you're not familiar, this is downtown Houston obviously, I'm highlighting near north side, which is a deeds restricted middle class Latinx neighborhood. These are pictures from the actual community. In their words, this community was the ghetto, and if they couldn't find a comp in this area, they needed to pull from, and then they listed specific neighborhoods that were very far away geographically, much poorer, but predominantly Latinx. They explicitly, in the same sentence, compared it to the Heights, which is right there. Looks like this. It is a deeds-restricted middle-class white neighborhood. And then they said they needed to pull comps, that if they couldn't find comps from this, they would pull it, from University Park, which is right here, which is one of the wealthiest white neighborhoods in the city. So we have this ethnographic evidence of how they are doing this. But then me and my quant brain was like, all right, what kind of magic models can we run? So we got all the properties in the entire county. And because there's almost 1 million and it's Houston, we can throw in everything in the kitchen sink and run some fun models. So the first model we run is just purely holding racial neighborhood composition constant. These are pulling out from, extracting the results from the model. And what you see here is on average, just looking at neighborhood racial composition, white neighborhoods in Houston, this is 2015 data, are nearly $500,000. Compared to houses and Black and Latinx neighborhoods that are around $70,000. Now, that's not putting anything else. So let's first take into consideration that these houses might be different. There's that historical redlining. There's all sorts of things. So we can put in all sorts of fun things from, is it a brick house? Does it have a fireplace? Does it have a pool? How big is it? How many bedrooms do you have? How many bathrooms do you have? Everything you might have in appraisal is appraisal data. We got it. We can throw it in, magic, woohoo, and we see what happens. Okay, inequality decreases. Good, we'd expect that because now we're comparing exact same houses. But we're comparing the exact same houses, and there's still over a $200,000 difference in what these houses are being appraised at. Now let's take into factors of the neighborhood. We can look at the exact school that every single house is zoned to for elementary school and look at the school ratings. Of course, not perfect, but scores that people who are appraising houses might look at. We can look at how close they are to parks, crime, poverty, socioeconomic status, education, what else we got in there? Employment, all that jazz and some more. And we see that it barely changes. Finally, we can put in the model real estate demand, so how fast are houses going off the market, how many people have to reduce their price before they sell, all that that narrative that it's just because these are the houses in demand, and in fact, the model changes not at all. At the end of the day, holding everything constant, these houses are about $230,000 in difference. So this was Houston. We started to be like, okay, how about the nation, and how about the historical story? So remember that last outlaw was 1977. So the first census after 1977 is, of course, 1980. So let's start in 1980. And these dots are not a model. They're purely descriptive. They're averages across the whole the whole country, we're using a very simple definition of white and communities of color right now, where we're just kind of cutting it by the 50 mark. It's very basic. So that means that these are descriptive results. They're very conservative. But as you can see, in 1980, houses in white neighborhoods are worth about twice as much as houses in community of color. That makes sense, given all that redlining stuff that I just talked about. But watch what happens over the last 35 years. In fact, the inequality we see in 1980 has over doubled in 2015, which is showing that it's not just a historical problem, it's a contemporary one, which we're seeing with the ethnographic data I just mentioned. But because we can, let's throw some more fun models. So particularly, we can hold all those things constant, and they're slightly different because this is slightly different data, but we can hold those things constant and basically hold the neighborhoods and the houses constant and then make the projection. Okay, so this is the descriptive. That's just how it is. This is with a projection. So what this is showing is the same house in a similar neighborhood, and now we have much more specific definitions of these neighborhoods because we have a much more robust neighborhood, and you see a similar story. In fact, if you can see it visually, the story is even more dramatic. On average, a house has appreciated in real dollars from 1980 to 2015. If it's in a white neighborhood, it's appreciated. So those people have gained this much wealth, approximately $225,000. An average house in a community of color has only appreciated $31,000. This is real dollars, not inflation. So if we want to talk inflation, this is a much worse story. So we know racial inequality is bad. Look where it's rooted. Almost all of our national stories about racial wealth inequality are parallel very, very closely to this housing piece, which of course, oh, okay, sorry, one more thing and then I'll wrap it back to this. So just because we can and because it's super fun, because this is longitudinal data and we can run like a dynamic panel modeling, I can't even say it, and I highly doubt that anyone, maybe two of you in this room, has any clue what I'm talking about, but just trust me, it's super fun. But really, why it's so fun is because it enables us to say how much of what this inequality is going on is because we're pulling from the history, because we're pulling from that historical inequality, and how much of it is because of who's living in this place right now. So we run that model. This is a hypothetical graph that basically says the yellow line, so these are two hypothetical neighborhoods that were exactly the same racial composition, that had exactly the same appraisal values in 1980. The yellow, whatever color that is, line is a neighborhood in that time that became more white. If you want to think about it in the gentrifying term, they became more white. While the blue line is a neighborhood that became more black or Latinx. So what you see here is it's not just the historical piece, but the contemporary racial dynamics and how those are being embedded are being picked up and manifested in these inequalities in those broader numbers that I'm showing you. So all this put together gets us back to why the story we're seeing with natural disasters is playing out. If we are invested in fixing the property, that means when people come in, they use the same appraisal methods, generally speaking, to evaluate how much the property is worth and thus how much damage has been done. So even if it's the same house, and we know this is true in cities, right? You have houses that were built at the same time, they actually look really similar, like those houses I showed you from Houston. But if I come in and tell you that your house is worth only $50,000, and this person over here is the same house is worth $250,000, and half the house got destroyed, then you're getting such a smaller portion of the A than this person over here, which is why this wealth inequality, or one of the main reasons this wealth inequality is manifesting. So that's my why. So now the so what. So many of you have actually got to hear me the last couple hours talk to various groups of students, and you've heard me talk about how, for me, research is one thing, but it has to be paired with action, and it has to be paired with policy decisions. And so this work, as was mentioned earlier, has gotten picked up in various ways, many of which are kind of mind-boggling looking back and like, how did that happen? But very grateful. And so the disaster wealth piece in particular was picked up by NPR and some different outlets, and then it started to be cited habitually on the Hill last year in hearings. And because of that, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Benny Thompson then picked it up as justification for a Government Accountability Office investigation, which is currently underway, which has put the National Advisory Board for FEMA kind of on the guard, and they are now working on doing a full investigation themselves as a preliminary or preliminary of what the GAO is going to come with to figure out which parts of their policies are what's going on and how to do it. So I've been working with all of those groups as well as a broader project with Columbia World Projects, working with the state and the federal level, thinking about on both the broader policies but also on the mechanisms, how these are being implemented, what's going on, and how can we reshape the very notion of how we should respond to disasters and how we should think about who's winning and who's losing and what does that mean? Not to mention that I have another whole project working on the appraisal side itself explicitly and thinking about how the federal government created this industry. The federal government can do something about this industry. What can we do and how can we think not only about what's going on in the contemporary, but also how to deal with not just the historical insurrections, but what's happened since 1980. We're talking our lifespans have quadrupled some of this, in some cases, inequality. What can we do about that, much less tracing all the way back to the 1930s? So with that, and all of its manifestations, I will pause and open it up for your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Howell. I really appreciate that fascinating and eye-opening research. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. I'll bring you the microphone, and you can say it to the rest of the room.
So back to the point when you were talking about FDR's system and how redlining was put into effect, you talked about the comp system, but I think I missed the definition. Could you just go over that one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So comps is short for comparable sales. So that's the full name. I get so used to saying comp all the time that sometimes I forget that's even a short thing. So the definition of that is a practice for or a way of appraising in which you use what is understood to be comparable houses as the baseline for how to evaluate the price of the current property that you're looking to evaluate. So by itself, it's just about saying, instead of looking at this, like we could appraise properties in lots of different ways. Like we could use a big computer machine, right? And like say we're gonna put all these factors in and then like determine it by like what the material in the property is. We could think about it as far as how many people are trying to live in this space and all sorts of different things. But so this is a particular way of figuring out how much property is cost and or should be worth. And what it is, the base of it is picking other properties that have sold recently and determining, using that as a determination of how much that property should sell. And the thing about it is that there's no official way of picking those comps, but the historical and contemporary way of picking those comps is to pick them in racially similar areas. Does that help clarify? Awesome.
Junia, this is super interesting stuff. The housing piece, is literally concrete in some cases.
Yes.
But that middle part that you were talking about, like the forms and the bureaucracy and navigating that, and I'm thinking about like renters and people who then like lose their address because of natural disasters. And have you done some research to figure out how the system of compensation that's dealing with these less tangible things is advantaging certain populations over others?
Yeah, so that, as I kind of alluded to, so some of this current work that I'm doing is getting at that more, and it's currently in more of a preliminary. All right, I'm sorry, I'm going to just take this necklace off because it starts getting caught and then I can't move, which clearly is a problem. So I should have done that a long time ago. Anyways, so this work that I'm doing, my own work I'm doing on is on the preliminary side. So I'm actually been meeting with different agencies and different people, but not in a systematic way yet of who've experienced. But I'm also, of course, doing a lot of reading. And the positive thing about a lot of literature is because it's case studies, then there's a lot of narrative and stories about these. And so it's actually helping me kind of see where the processes are unfolding. So to try to structure the answer, one of it, as I already insinuated, is the documentation piece. So if that's the deed of a house, but also if that's your lease, right? Having documentation that you live there. Something that happens in a lot of cities is that leases run out and people let the leases run out. And that's advantageous for the property owner and rarely the renter, but sometimes the renter, and so often that doesn't happen. So you're still allowed to live there, you just have a month to month, but that often means there's actually no paperwork. And so there can be complicated cases about your legality to claim anything, much less to mention that much of what they're restoring is often, again, not your life, your property, and so what's getting restored when you don't have claims to that space. There's also a lot of layers about who's, depending on the size of the family. So you might have the deed, but by you, I mean like the person whose name is on the deed might have the deed, but their grown children might be living with them. Their grown children's children could be living with them. So how much aid that family gets if they qualify for like a relocation piece, right? So part of it is like when you need to move immediately to then be relocated back later, if you only can establish that 2 people live in this house because the grown people don't count and their children don't count because they're not the people who live there, so it depends on the program, but there's lots of pieces where it's set up for you to have all your documentation, know where it is, and be a nuclear family. And if you are not in that, then there's a lot of issues. And so if you know anything about class and race and immigration status in the US, you know that all those things then immediately intersect and have those manifestations. So one of the issues is like the paperwork that is actually necessary. A second issue is how the funds actually can be allocated. So there is a lot of rules about which money can go where, right? So you qualify, so there's lots of really compelling narratives and stories about this where like a family qualifies, they get $2,000, that money is supposed to go, for example, like to help, that's relocation money to help them like get a new, down payment. They also qualify for other money down the road, but they got this first check first. And there's numerous examples of this where people are like, okay, I'm looking for housing, I can't find it. One of the reasons I can't find it is because my car got flooded in the natural disaster. I don't have a car. I'm gonna use that $2,000 to get a car so that I can drive around to find the housing and so I don't lose my job because I can't get to my job right now, and if I lose my job, then it's a worse situation. If they do that, the federal government will by often I mean almost always, disqualify them for any of the other aid that would have gone to their car or anything else because they misused their funds, which is against the policy. So that there are these rigid, and this is where it's also then connected to the multiple agencies. So for example, because it's all partnerships, FEMA is paying for certain things, HUD's paying for other things. If you misuse one of those checks you got on the other thing, then you can be disqualified for both agencies. So okay, so one is you need paperwork. 2 is there's lots of specificity of what you can use this money for. And when you don't have money, that matters, right? And so let me just step back a second. If this happened to me, I have some cash flow. I also have parents that have cash flow. I have siblings that have cash flow. If I got a check for $2,000 and it was supposed to go to something and I needed something else, and heck, I have Wheaton family, right? Like I have privilege of all these people that I could call up and be like, can you spot me 500, can you spot me 1K, right? I need this so that then I can use this other money. Like even if I was in a bad situation, right, I could do that. But if you don't have those networks, if your networks are also all in the city that just got hit and everyone's struggling, then this is compounding, and this is also why race and class and immigration status then intersect, right? So even if you, for example, are a quote unquote like poor white person, but if you have different kind of networks, these manifest in these ways. So rules around it, the actual paperwork that's needed. And the third element, that's one that I'm just really starting to get really fascinated by, is that there's so much paperwork coming in and so many different demands that very understandably, the person sitting there going through the paperwork is gonna throw out anything that's not filled out right. And that's completely legal and completely legitimate and happens all the time. So all these things aren't right. Your application gets out or gets back to you and you have to refill it out. In fact, and this is anecdotal, I don't know how pervasive it is, but I'm hearing it over and over that many people with means and or just networks call a lawyer to help them figure out how to fill out the paperwork. So if you have a lawyer friend, and you can make that phone call, and or you have the means to pay a lawyer or have one on whatever, you're much more likely to get through some of those initial processes than if you don't have it, or if it's confusing, or if just confessing everything about all your financial situation is overwhelming because of elements of incarceration or past debt or collections or all those kind of things. So then just becomes kind of this compiling element. And the other piece of it is there's a lot of discretionary decisions that are happening on the micro and the macro level, about even the county levels, where there are literally at some points panels of people or individuals who are making decisions about if this person's getting it or not. And just like any kind of other aid in our country, there's lots of evidence that if you come in and you talk a certain way, or perceived as not perceived as disrespectful, or perceived as like being hostile, you're way less likely to kind of get through some of those just people making those decisions. And of course, those are also gendered and racialized and classed. No, I have a question. Yeah.
So I don't usually do this, but I'm going to sneak in 3 questions, if that's all right.
Yes. All right. I just got to keep them straight. Do I need to write them down?
So first, dynamic panel modeling.
Yes.
Tell us all about it.
Really?
Well, tell us the nutshell version.
Okay.
Number 2, when you showed the graph from 1980 to the present, there was a long stretch in which we're returning to it. Perfect. In which the proportion doesn't seem to change much. Of course, the inequality persists, but the proportion doesn't change much. And I wonder what commentary you have on the proportion not changing for a while and then widening all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And then my last question is a policy question for you.
Great.
If you had to pull one lever, you only get one for now, right? Where would you start?
Yes. So Mennonite dinner, we kind of answered this, right? So that's fun. I'm going to answer this question first since I pulled it up. Okay, so you'll notice, now granted, this is census, I'm showing you census data right now because I'm trying to show you complete data, which means that this is decennial, so it's not the ACS, which comes later, the long form. So I have a mark at 1990 and a mark at 2000. What you'll notice is that proportion that I was talking about starts to diverge there. Now, it's not very dramatic. It gets really dramatic in the next decade. Well, what happened is around 1995, 1996 is when the implications of the 1992 and 1993 Clinton reform on housing is happening, right? So if you're not familiar, Clinton administration gets put up in 92, and I think it gets through in 93, or maybe it's 93, 94. I need to check that, sorry. Around there, mid-90s, they change some of the regulation around mortgaging, which then exacerbates what Dr. Taylor, in her new book, if you haven't read it, it's a great book, Race for Profit, talks about as, predatory inclusion. So the inclusion of the Black community into home ownership, but the intentional inclusion of them into either dilapidated homes that shouldn't be inhabited and overpriced, or inclusion under what we now kind of call subprime mortgages, et cetera. So that's already happening. That starts in the 1980s, but the 1990s reforms of banking and mortgages start to exacerbate that. So mid-1990s is when you really start seeing that play out. That really starts playing out even more in the early 2000s. And so that is where this gap just starts expanding. Now, what's interesting is leading up to 2008, we tell a narrative that houses in Black and brown communities were being overpriced, and that's why things defaulted. Most recent research is really deconstructing that and being like, actually, that's not what's going on. It's a combination of the financing that was predatory, but also the differentiation that's happening, where houses in white neighborhoods are just starting to balloon in their housing cost, and that inequality is then perpetuating what's going on a broader scale because of economics and selling and like how the market is so intertwined in all these things. So that's a long circular way to say, yes, you're right, So we can trace it partially to what's happening in the mid-1990s, and then it really gets huge leading up to the 2008 crash. The interesting thing when you look, particularly from 2008, 2015, when you look at yearly data of appraisals, of course, 2009 is when the biggest kind of drop in housing prices happened, so after the 2008 crash. But by the time you get to 2010, and in most cities by the time you get to 2011, almost all predominantly white neighborhoods have recouped their prices and then start going up again. And most communities of colors have still not recouped their prices from before 2008. So the impact, particularly on housing prices, but then on all sorts of other implications, education, wealth, health, et cetera, the white community has done all right after the housing crash, while communities of color are still suffering from that. So that's answer there, if that's answer. Dynamic panel modeling. I can't even say that right now. I'll go back. I do love it. It is fun. Basically, it's an estimation tool that is, to be honest, I'm playing with it even more because I have a full census and I don't have a sample. So I can even do another level of dynamic paneling model because for those of you who've been in a class and heard of statistical significance and think you need statistical significance, well, statistical significance is only telling you that a particular sample may or may not be representative of a whole population. But when you have the whole population, when you have a whole census, statistical significance means absolutely nothing and arguably should never be used because there's no theoretical justification for it because you're not projecting on anything. Which means then you have more room with standard errors in a model to play with what's going on. So dynamic panel modeling is basically a technique that's using GMM to isolate the previous dependent, it's a longitudinal model that's isolating the effect of a previous dependent variable on the current. So basically it's saying what is the appraisal in 1980 effect on 1990, what is the appraisal of 1980 and 1990 on 2000, while holding constant the variables. I know I'm probably losing most of you. I'm getting a few head nods, give me a second. The variables from the present for each of those decades while doing a lag of the previous decade, so taking the effect of what's present versus what's the change, if that makes sense. And it's the statistical model to deal with the heterogeneity and collinearity that might happen, but a lot of that, again, doesn't apply when you don't have standard errors, so then you can even do more with the model. Does that make sense? Okay. One person in the room followed me. I feel good. Sorry if you didn't, but the lesson of that is like math is really fun and has great power in social policy. So on the policy side, if I had to pull one lever, my heart right now is on this appraisal piece. I think, if you've been in any policy circles, affordable housing is the talk of the day. If you've been in any city, affordable housing is coming up over and over and over. I would argue that at the core of affordable housing is unequitable appraisals. The reason that we have an affordable housing crisis is because we decided in 1934 that housing shouldn't be about embodied places to live, but should be about a wealth generation tool. And if it's about a wealth generating tool, we're always going to have an affordable housing issue because those two things don't mesh. If it's about making money, it's not going to be affordable. And so we need to I would argue we need to disentangle wealth generation, not generation, whatever, getting money, making more money from the housing piece. And in doing that, also deal with the historical racial inequities that are embedded in that. That would affect the FEMA piece, right? And so those are intertwined. And again, we're talking billions of dollars that are being allocated based on the appraisal. That would also affect just people owning their homes as well as affordable housing, which then has impacts on, of course, education, transportation, stability, if you can stay somewhere, all of that. So right now, my heart attention is on that piece.
Probably have time for one more question.
Thanks so much. Amazing. My question is actually on behalf of students who might be interested in pursuing sociological research. Can you describe how a grown-up graduate and professional lab in Soch works? Like, how does your research work?
Good question. I don't know. What do I do? No, it's a great question. Thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, I jokingly say I don't know because just like mini jobs, it's so different from day to day that it's easier to be like, I don't know, because it's like, how do I distill what actually happens? So for me, and it's also very different for different people, right? So I'll tell you what's going on for me, which I know is true of some of my friends, but definitely different for others. So I spend a lot of time, and I wish a lot more time than I actually get to spend, playing with data. So this literally means I'm working right now. I have the privilege of having money to pay other people to help me play with data now, which is a great thing. So that's where the kind of the lab piece comes into play. So I have a team of graduate students actually at Yale, Columbia, and Pittsburgh, which is interesting to manage people at 3 different institutions, just a side note. And right now, I have different projects going on, obviously. I have literally about 20 projects going on. But on the FEMA project right now, I'm having computer science students actually write big scraping models that are going in and scraping data off of government websites. Basically, it's legal. I promise, it's not like illegal. But we're trying to get every single application for FEMA aid over a 15-year period. So we're talking like hundreds of millions of applications and information on those applications, and then creating, basically we'll link that to their addresses and link that to school data, census data, economic data, as well as natural hazard data, and basically create a very specific model on policy explicitly to look more in a more granular way who's applying, kind of back to what I was talking about Brian Howell's question, like who's getting to the application stage, who's not getting to the application stage, who's getting to the application stage and then not getting money. So basically disentangling that, and hopefully because it's such massive data, being able to put some price tags on it and saying like, X amount of money is going from our federal government to this population versus this population. So I can do the models that I have right now that are about, because it's using samples to look at families and estimate across families, but this will give me an ability to say like, this exact amount of money has gone from our federal government into these kind of households or into these kind of neighborhoods. So it literally means I spend a lot of time like writing code on a computer that like scrapes things, that connects things, that finds different data. Yes, I would say the bulk of my research time is writing computer code, loops, all those kind of things if you've taken any of those classes, and imagining ways of understanding what's going on and exploring that. Another part of my time is, and I get to do this less than I would like, but is doing some interviewing. More right now, I'm actually designing interviewing and sampling things and then having grad students do it, to be very honest. And then I am a professor, so I do sometimes teach. I mean, to be honest, I teach 1 day a week for 2.5 hours, and that's it, and I only do that. I only like prep for a few hours before that. So really my work is research. I don't really teach. I'm not a teaching professor. And so then the other big chunk of my work, which is really interesting and not true of many academic researchers, is I spend time talking to reporters, a lot of time talking to reporters, a lot of time talking to policy people on every level, and working with them and thinking about, they'll reach out to me or I'll reach out to them. A lot of it is actually just like networking and relationship building and telling them things, both reporters and policy people, telling them things like that are coming down the pipeline, how we might spin a story, what their constituents might be interested in, and figuring out how we can change that into policy. Is that an answer? All right, awesome. Thank you all so much for coming. I will stay and answer more questions.